This is normal. This is how our family works.
I would never let something like that happen to me.
She's been known to act a little crazy.
Why doesn't she just leave? This is what we're told domestic violence looks like. These are the real faces of domestic violence.
I never knew domestic violence existed until I realized that's exactly what my childhood consisted of. My family had our struggles, but it wasn't until I saw my mother being abused that nothing else mattered. My mom met a man she fell in love with. He had been a former sheriff and had been going to school to become a nurse. He promised us trust and security, but gave no red flags to what he was really capable of. As the only father figure in my life, he expected me to look for protection from him. What seemed like a normal family on the outside was far from it behind closed doors.
I was young and convinced that I was never going to find that perfect match, and then I found him. He was handsome, adventurous, and outdoorsy. He took me out on dates. He called when he said he'd call. At first, I thought it was really sweet that he cared so much, but then I started to feel pressure to answer the phone when he'd call. When we'd go out, if another man even looked in my direction, he'd make a scene. He started pressuring me to wear clothing that was less sexy. I didn't see it coming. It happened gradually.
I am the oldest of 5 children and used to being helpful. Turn the other cheek. Jesus first, others second, and yourself last. I had just finished high school and I met a man who wanted to spend every minute with me. I was so excited. His dad told me not to spend too much time with him and warned me about getting too close. We got married 16 months later. 2 years into our marriage, I gave birth to our first child. We fought constantly about whether or not I would go back to volunteer work teaching in this Christian school. After months of arguing, he, along with 2 men from our church congregation, sat me down in my living room and told me that I would be going back to volunteering to teach the church school kids. I refused. They told me not to worry, that my child would be safe with his father who worked the graveyard shift, but I knew, and so I still refused. He reminded me often of the day that I chose not to obey him.
You may think that if anyone had seen an abusive relationship coming, that it would have been me. I was a journalist covering crime in court, and I saw cases of domestic violence all the time. But that's the thing about abusive relationships. They don't start out that way. I met a guy who came back to our hometown to help his mom move. While I had gone to college and started a career, he had traveled and lived all over the country, from DC to California. I had never left Pennsylvania, so by the time I met him, I was ready for adventure. 6 months later, we were standing in front of a judge in San Francisco getting married. Now, the movies might tell you that this is romance, but I actually know now that it's a red flag.
We tried so hard to believe we had a normal life. I spent every day trying to find happiness in a house full of violence and hate. I was taught that inside the house, we were allowed to fight and argue, but outside the house, we were expected to be best of friends. We had to answer to him. We became afraid if we didn't. He had access to all my mother's paychecks and bank accounts, and all family members were blocked from our phones. When I was in middle school, my curfew after a sleepover was always 10 a.m. One morning, I came home tired. I was not allowed to be tired. Out of anger, he threw my mother into a 50-pound stone coffee table and blamed it on me. As she fell to the ground and began to crawl away, he kicked her with his boots on. I gathered my siblings and brought them downstairs to safety. For the longest time, I blamed myself for that day. He was a manipulator and a bully with the intent to keep us there forever.
I was a strong, career-minded, independent woman. Abuse didn't happen to women like me. I wasn't about to admit to it. I didn't need help. He alienated me from all my friends, convincing me that my closest friend was a bad influence, and so I pulled away from her. During the winter, he lived out of state and he would call me constantly. If I didn't answer the phone by 8 p.m., he'd leave me mean messages. When I finally did answer the phone, he'd call me a slut and ask me to prove that I was at home alone. "Let me hear your cat meow," he'd say. In the summer, he'd return to Montana and he would torment my cats at night while I slept. Things started to not feel right. On an out-of-town trip, he became extremely jealous when we ran into an old high school friend of mine. He locked me out of our hotel room. When I was finally able to get into the room and tried to use the phone to call my sister, he broke the phone to pieces. He pushed me to the ground and began punching me in the ribs. His friends were in the room next door. They heard everything, and they did nothing. I couldn't hide it any longer. I needed help.
The constant in my life was shame. Because of shame, I thought I was the one that was crazy. "You're too friendly, too outgoing. You talk too much." He would also remind me that I was selfish, sullen, unthankful. I was so confused. He'd often remind me how I didn't pay attention to details. One time, I found my shoes on top of the refrigerator after I'd got home from work. I wondered quietly aloud to myself how they could have got there, and he came around the corner and told me if I paid better attention to where I put things, I wouldn't be losing them. He was a truck driver, making good money, driving truck, gone for weeks at a time. We never saw the money because he spent it on drugs and other women. When friends would invite me and my children to go on outings, I had to decline because we couldn't even afford to pay the electric bill. Eventually, people stopped asking me to hang out with them. I wouldn't want to be my friend either.
Things started to change when we moved to Montana. He told me my friends and family weren't good enough, and soon I wasn't good enough. He told me that I was weak and needy. He stopped wanting to go out with me because he said that I wasn't any fun. Then, when we did go out, I was having too much fun, and I was embarrassing him. I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. After a few years of this, I started talking about leaving, and that's when things turned physically violent. He smashed my jewelry box, punched holes in our walls, and threatened our dogs' lives. On Christmas morning, he grabbed the vacuum cleaner out of my hand and smashed all of the presents underneath the tree because it was interrupting his TV show. I left. A few weeks later, I went back to get my baking supplies. When I got there, he was there, and we started to fight. I tried to leave, but he dragged me back inside, knocked my legs out from under me, pushed me onto the floor, and pulled a knife on me. I was able to get away and call 911 when he went outside to throw my car keys in the snow.
Our community took us in with open arms. Due to the circumstances, we immediately had to go into hiding. I maintained a job so I can help my family, and we utilized local resources from food to clothing to finding a safe home. Even though we had to block all our extended family out of our lives, they did not give up on us. Without friends, family, and a strong support system, I would not be on this stage today. Our goal is not only to save people from abuse, but from violence and discrimination as well. I may not be fully healed, but I am more strong now than I have ever been. We did not get here alone.
Domestic violence is uncomfortable to discuss. Imagine how difficult it can be to leave. I loved him, and I couldn't believe that he could be capable of abuse. Even after the physical violence, I wasn't prepared to leave. He convinced me that I was crazy, so I started to see a counselor. She gave me a book on emotional abuse. The book made me think deeper about my relationship. I gained the courage to leave when a friend said to me, "You don't deserve to be treated this way." He told me that I deserved more and that he'd be there for me. I also had a girlfriend who firmly stuck by my side, even when I hit the lowest low. Knowing that I would have those two people through the struggle of leaving was overwhelming. I left because I had those two people who refused to turn a blind eye to my situation. They provided me with complete support. There was no judgment.
After 12 years, I began to search for freedom. I hadn't been to church in over 2 years. He wouldn't allow it. Alone at work one day, where my only social outlet was, I searched online for help. I found Haven, the domestic violence shelter here in Bozeman. 24 hours later, my 3 children and I were sitting in Haven's undisclosed location, waiting for our restraining order to be served against what would be the man who left our lives. Without people in this community, strangers, I would not be here today. They offered support, they gently listened, and they gave me the help that I needed. Thank you.
My parents were the first ones to tell me what was happening early on sounded like emotional abuse. Coworkers found me a place to stay and watched my cat when I was afraid to leave her at the house. Haven's legal advocate helped me get an order of protection. I testified against my now ex-husband at his sentencing hearing and represented myself in court when I had to get my order of protection extended. I truly believe I would not be here if it wasn't for the help of others, but I also would not be here if it wasn't for me standing up for myself. Victims of domestic violence do not need to be rescued, but they do need your help.
Domestic violence thrives in the shadows. By not talking about it, we'd be pretending that it doesn't exist. But it does exist, and we're choosing to talk about it. Since we started to share our stories, we have impacted this community. We share the most sincere yet tragic details to expose domestic violence for what it is, in the hope of helping others.
Now it's your turn to help. Maybe you are suffering silently alone. Maybe you know someone who is. Maybe you're curious or wondering and you're just not sure. Go ahead and ask questions. Offer to listen. Just by broaching the subject and bringing an awareness, you can help save someone's life.
My doors are always open for you.
Abuse can happen to anyone. It doesn't mean you're a weak person.
No matter what's going on, there's always more to the story.
I know you love him. When you want to talk, I'm here to listen.
Now it's your turn to shine a light on domestic violence.
Thank you.
Look, guys, we got a standing ovation. Thank you.
You guys, come and take